We are a little over 24 hours from the Eagles preseason game 2. You can hear all the action right here on 97.3 ESPN as the Eagles travel to Jacksonville. Although the Cowboys have a better trip than the Eagles, the Cowboys get to go to Hawaii for their next preseason game. I think John McMullen would agree that going to Hawaii is a much better trip than Jacksonville.
Yeah, I would say slightly. Although, it depends where you are. First coast of Florida, that could be exciting, especially if you're up here.
Well, true, that's true.
So I'll take first coast of Florida, and then I'll take Hawaii.
Okay.
I'll put Hawaii above it, though.
I'm glad we made that delineation on the record. Now the audience is that much smarter for it. Bad job by me. Anyway, John, appreciate you coming on as you do every day. So tomorrow, the preseason game, we all are under the understanding that we're not going to see Foles. We're not going to see Wentz out there. But what I wanted to start off asking you, John, is I feel like the Eagles' approach to this preseason with their quarterback is much different than other teams around the league. There are plenty of teams around the league that have been playing their starters. For example, Pat Mahomes played a series. We've seen other quarterbacks around the league play a series, at least in the first game. I wanted to ask you, though, can you explain to the audience a little bit about what is the Eagles' strategy and why are they treating their quarterback situation different than some of the other teams around the league? And I think we all agree that Pat Mahomes doesn't need to be out there. Maybe Deshaun Watson doesn't need to be out there. How much of this, the Eagles not playing Wentz, has to do with the offensive line injuries more so than Wentz himself?
Yeah, I don't know if he'd be playing even if there weren't offensive line injuries. Lane Johnson, the Eagles shut him down for the same reason they're not going to play Carson Wentz, and the fact that they want him to be healthy for week 1. I imagine Jason Kelce won't play. Jason Peters, we know, is always on a pitch count. So when you do that, then you're saying to yourself, do you really want the guy you just paid $108 million to be behind a bunch of second stringers? So that's probably no. It's up to each individual coach. Some guys think differently. Andy's one of those old school guys, Andy Reid. He still goes away for training camps. He still believes in it a little bit. I think things as a whole are trending more in the direction of the Eagles than not. But I think people might be a little upset early in the season because I do think things are going to be a little sloppy. But I think you see that around the NFL. And it's become a cost-benefit analysis, and the Eagles have decided it's more important to get to the season with all your key pieces as healthy as possible versus getting them reps. And then the second part, I would say the Ravens are in next week for joint practices. So I think that changed the mentality on week 3 preseason, which is the traditional dress rehearsal game. And Doug has kind of said that because the first team players will get so many good reps in practice against the Ravens that he'll probably scale back their playing time in week 3. So I think it's a bunch of things, and all of that enters into it. As far as Carson himself, he said he doesn't care if he plays or he doesn't play. And that kind of sums up the thought process of the preseason as a whole for most veteran players. They don't need it, but if you got to do it, they'll go out there.
John, you mentioned the fact that Andy Reid is more of an old school coach and Doug is more of a new school coach. How much do you feel that Doug's influence as a coach has to do with the influence of the fact that he did play quarterback in the NFL? Do you think that he takes some of his experiences and that's part of what it influences his decision-making? Or do you feel like the reasons why he makes the decisions he does has more to do with the different coaches he's worked under before even he worked with Andy?
Well, I think it's a combination of everything. He learned most of what he knows as a head coach from Andy, so it doesn't mean he's going to do everything exactly the same. And he is his own man, and he's got his own theories and his own mind, and I think he's gone through it now for a number of years. And They did play more when he first got here, the starters as a whole, in the preseason than they are now or projected to be now. And I think that's an evolution, and everybody goes through an evolution as a coach. And he's decided that it's not as important as it once was. And I tend to be on his side of the fence. I kind of agree with that for the starters. And then, as I said, the Ravens, I mean, if this were a summer where they didn't have joint practices, they probably would play a little bit more in that week 3 preseason game. But I think that, which has happened in the past, the Dolphins have been in, the Ravens have been in before in recent years, the Patriots, if you go back to Chip Kelly were in. But it doesn't happen every year, and that changes things as well.
John, it's funny that you mentioned that, because is that where the teams around the league are going to start to do, not like coaches like Andy Reid, but like there's the new wave of coaches, the Sean McVays, the Cliff Kingsburys. Like in years to come, do you see the same thing happening, like trying to get more joint practices so the starters don't have to play in the preseason? Like I remember back in the day where, you know, the preseason used to be you would see the starters maybe 2 series or to a quarter in the first game, a half in the second game, to 3/4 in the third game, and you would never see them in the fourth game. Like, are those days over to where you're going to see a lot more starters throughout the years just not play at all?
Yeah, I think so. And Roger Goodell has even acknowledged that it needs to be scaled back to 2 games. Part of that is wrangling to get to 18 regular season games, but even he knows the product is atrocious, and it's not an NFL-level product. So from the league standpoint, it's tough to dress it up anymore and charge the prices they do, which are regular season prices. I mean, people say that the tickets are cheaper, but you're getting them secondhand. They're not cheaper for season ticket holders. They're bundled in. They have to buy them. And the Eagles do a nice little shell game with the face value of the ticket. The face value will be less, but you kind of, people point to that and you say, get a number and we'll use $300. It's far more than that, but just to make it simple for people. So if that's what you want, you do the 10 games and you get the 300, and you charge a little bit more for the regular season games. They think they're getting a deal. They're not getting a deal. They're forced to buy these tickets. So you can get to a certain level, and the parking's the same, and the concessions are the same. The cost, it's atrocious from that level, from a fan perspective. Unless you get tickets secondhand, you can't afford season tickets. You want to see the Eagles or a facsimile of the Eagles. I get that part of it, but again, when Roger Goodell acknowledges something stinks in the NFL, it's got to stink pretty badly. So that tells you what the preseason is.
Yeah, I mean, as a fan, you look at it and you see that, okay, you're excited for football. Everyone is waiting week 1, but you kind of get a taste of it with a preseason. I mean, you know that it's a dry product and it's not really good football, but it's football nonetheless, and it gives you something to do on a Thursday evening. My last question to you, Josh, is that when you look at the Eagles going into week 1 and the starters aren't going to have a lot of preseason reps, you said that you think that they might be rusty. Coming out the gate, you got a division rival in Washington. You got to go on a Sunday night road game against the Atlanta Falcons. Is this something that could possibly lead to an early season slump?
It's possible, but again, I think you have to use it in context to the rest of the league. A lot of teams do this, and you see sloppy football generally early in the NFL season, all over the league, not just in Philadelphia. Now, fans here and fans in other cities tend to get myopic with their team, so they'll see the sloppiness and they'll say, what the heck is going on here? It's essentially a glorified preseason because they're not preparing like they used to for the regular season. And so they're no different than any other team. So I think part of it from an Eagles standpoint is, yeah, it'll be sloppy, but we got better players than the Redskins, so we'll probably win that game. And I think that's how they look at it. But you might see a hiccup early in the season. People will get upset by it, no question. And I don't think there's any question at all you're going to see some sloppy football. But it's not just going to be the Eagles.
John, there's a little bit of noise surrounding Big V and a potential trade. Do you think moving on from him is a real possibility? I know the Texans are looking for a tackle, and Clowney's a name out there. Have you heard anything?
Well, yeah, people are going nuts about Jadeveon Clowney. I mean, I talk to Mike about this all the time. I mean, if you got a big name, people want him in Philadelphia. And you have to understand he makes $16 million. When he signs his franchise tag, if he signs his franchise tag. You can't work out an extension because the deadline has passed. So, in essence, you only get him for 1 year. If you're paying somebody $16 million, you're getting them to play them. So that means either, and I was tweeting back and forth with Chris Long today, and he said the same thing. One of two things has to happen. The guy you just paid, Brandon Graham, is not going to play, or Derek Barnett, your former first-round pick, is not going to play. So, yeah, I don't see it happening. Howie Roseman's Howie Roseman. I always leave a sliver of a door open because he likes look-at-me moments, and he likes to pull off things like this. So I'm not going to say it's impossible, but I think it would create more problems than it would solve. And I haven't even gotten to what the Texans would want in return, which would be significant assets. So anybody's thinking they can send Halapoulivaati Vaitai a mid-round pick for Jadeveon Clowney, no. It ain't going to happen. The Texans might not have a general manager. They might have had a terrible offseason, but they're not that doofus from draft day and with Kevin Costner. They're not that dumb. This is a big-time player. So you're going to have to give up significant assets as well. There's too many hurdles for the Eagles to pull off something like that.
Come on, John. You're telling me that they're not asking for David Putney as to be added into the deal?
Yeah, you would have to have a GM like I forget his name, that Jacksonville GM in that movie, which was given the worst trades ever. The Texans, they want Jadeveon Clowney. They want him back. They want him to play for them. They've handled the situation very, very poorly. But that would, again, who's not going to play? Derek Barnett? Think about what the Eagles have done to get reps for Derek Barnett. They traded Michael Bennett.
Yeah.
They essentially let Chris Long retire, all to clear a path so Derek Barnett can get significant snaps. And now all of a sudden you're going to stop that? Or the other side of the coin is you're not going to play Brandon Graham, which, I wrote about this today on 973ESPN.com. I have no idea. It's so weird to me that a fan base doesn't understand how good a player has been for an organization, in a case of Brandon Graham for the Eagles, all because he hasn't gotten 10 sacks. And the irony of that is Brandon's best season was 9.5 sacks. Guess what Jadeveon Clowney's best season to date was? 9.5 sacks.
John McMullen joining us, the Boardwalk on the Hotlines. He does every day of football at 4 here on 97.3 ESPN. Follow him on Twitter at JF McMullen. It's at JF McMullen on Twitter. Check out all of his work at 97.3ESPN.com. Josh Hennig, Hunter Birdie, Deshaun Hendricks filling in for Mike Gill on a Hump Day Wednesday on the Sports Bash. John, by the way, speaking of draft day, is there anybody more of an awkward, nervous wreck from a movie than the Jacksonville GM? I mean, that guy was a disaster zone. He looked like he just wanted to cry and go home.
Yeah, and some people take that seriously, as that's how things happen in the NFL.
Right.
That's what I said. The Texans don't even have a general manager, and they're not going to be that dumb to accept Vaitai. And, a third part I didn't bring up, Brandon Brooks is getting a medical evaluation today, and he hopes to be cleared to get back to practice and team drills. Vaitai right now is a starting right guard. So until Brandon gets cleared, until the Eagles understand he's going to be healthy and ready to go, I don't even think they want to trade Vaitai at this stage. Now, maybe that changes in a couple weeks, but you're going to have to give up significantly more than Vaitai in a mid-round draft choice.
Yeah, and I would assume, John, that when you look around the NFL, it's actually better for the Eagles to wait out the preseason before trading Vaitai, I would think, because one, like you said, he is your right guard right now, and two, why not wait till the end of the preseason and you can get a desperate team who maybe had an injury in week 3 or in practice after the 4th week? You can take advantage of a situation like how we did with the Sam Bradford situation with Minnesota.
Yeah, exactly. You wait for desperation and then you pull the trigger, and that's what the Eagles did so well with Sam Bradford, and that worked out beautifully for them. It's probably not going to happen. Those circumstances don't come around the corner often. So it's unlikely, but I think in a lot of ways Vaitai is more valuable to the Eagles than he is with a trade and what you might be able to get back for him, because they have turned him into a very versatile player, can play inside and outside. And he's another guy people often criticize because he's not Jason Peters. He's not Lane Johnson. But, hey, by definition, he proved good enough to win a Super Bowl with. So I think that's a check mark in his column. And that's what people point to with Nick Foles. How come it doesn't count with Big V?
Going back to Brandon Graham, do you think the lack of appreciation for him is because of his slow start to the career, or maybe because the fans wanted to draft Earl Thomas at that time?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with Earl and Jason Pierre-Paul, and it's kind of ironic because early it looked really bad, and the Eagles could have had both of those players. And if you think about it, Brandon has outlasted both in their particular organizations, which is pretty amazing. And even if you go back to when Chip was here, Brandon thought he was going to get cut for Travis Long before Travis Long, if you remember him, tore his ACL. And by the way, I think he might be right. I think Chip might have cut him because that's how bad he was with personnel. And then things kind of took off for him. So a lot of it had to do, if you remember, he tore his ACL in his rookie season. You had the constant back and forth between the 4-3, 3-4, back to the 4-3. But when he took off in a big way. And he's one of the best two-way edge players in this league, and he has been for about 4 years now. And I'm not going to say Earl Thomas is going to the Hall of Fame, so I don't think he's a better player than Earl Thomas. He has been a better player over the long run than Jason Pierre-Paul. Part of that maybe has to do with his accident. But nonetheless, if you just take it as a first-round pick, Brandon was a home run, is a home run. It just took a little while. So I do think people got into the mode and said, this guy's a bust, this guy's a bust, and all of a sudden he turned into a really good player. But it took a while.
John, switching a little away from the Eagles before we let you go here at Football 4 on 97.3 ESPN. John also covers the NFL for us at 97.3 ESPN.com. I was listening to the Peter King podcast this morning, John, and he had Richard Sherman on. And, well, I was listening because Sherman was on. I wasn't listening for Peter. But I like listening to Richard Sherman. I think he's an interesting guy. And I think Sherman brought up an interesting point. They were asking him about because he's part of the NFLPA's Players Committee. And Sherman brought up an interesting point about the negotiations with the NFL. He said that back in 09, 10, and 11, one of the reasons why they had the problems they did with the CBA negotiations was because anytime anyone disagreed, he said, the one side threw up their hands and left the room. He said this time around is totally different. He says they're talking through things or working through things. And he said that he thinks that's going to lead them to getting a deal done before the deadline. And he said, unless something crazy extreme happens, that he thinks a deal is going to get done. I want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's been the thought process around the league is a deal will get done. There's not going to be a lockout. There's certainly not going to be a strike. And I think Richard's one of those guys. It's interesting you bring him up I didn't know he was on that podcast. But he's one of those guys, and I've talked with him about this before, and we've talked about education, understanding what the important issues are. I think he now realizes that because he's close to the negotiation. You know, back when D. Smith was getting killed for the current CBA, Richard was one of those guys who pointed to the NBA at one of those free agency periods when you see those giant NBA contracts. And he said, look at the way they stood together and they have these giant gains in revenue. And the reality is, as you know, Josh, in 2011, the NBA players got killed in their lockout.
Yep.
They got destroyed. And the contracts took off because of a new TV deal, which spiked dramatically. It had nothing to do with the CBA. In fact, if it were under the prior CBA, the numbers you see would be even larger.
Correct.
So they took a giant hit from an actual revenue standpoint. And I pointed that out to Richard, and I think he understands, not because of our conversation, but as a whole, now that he's closer to the whole process, he kind of understands. And I say all the time, if they get their revenue split, none of the other ancillary stuff that everybody makes a big deal out of, whether it's personal conduct, marijuana testing, doesn't matter. It does not matter. It's all white noise.
Also, John, Richard Sherman echoed something that you have been saying. He vehemently said, I quantified as vehemently, but, you know, Richard, he measured his verbiage, but he was very a matter of fact when he said, you will not see an 18-game season, so.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's difficult, and that's a hurdle that the NFL has tried to come up with some interesting plans and the whole process, which I think would be coaches will hate. I've talked about this. If you get to 18 games, but you can only play players in 16 of them. So you can imagine if the Eagles are going for a playoff run down the stretch of the season and you can't play Carson Wentz, that would not make Doug look very good. So I think if they ultimately get to that plan, you'll see a lot of quarterbacks sitting out the first 2 games of the season because you'll want to get it over with quickly as a coach. So you might see a Nate Sudfeld for week 1 and week 2. Talk about glorified preseason. That's what the NFL regular season schedule might turn into. And from what Richard says, I mean, players can say that all they want. They certainly don't want to play 18 games, but when they see the revenue difference, they might change their thought process because they're going to play 16 games and they're going to tack on 2 games of TV revenue, which in this league is really, really significant when it comes to the bottom line.
He's John McMullen. Follow him on Twitter at JFMcMullen on Twitter for all your Eagles and NFL news and updates. Check out all of his work at 97.3 ESPN.com. John, hope you have a great rest of your day, and we'll chat with you tomorrow.
Hey, thank you, guys.